Good morning, everyone. My name is Gerard Delaney. I'm the Corporate Affairs Manager here at Leading Age Services Australia, based in Canberra. Welcome to this webinar opportunity this morning. We're delighted to have with us Ray Lamb, the Aged Care Complaints Commissioner, who has joined us at the invitation of our CEO, Sean Rooney, to run through a number of key issues and features of the Complaints Commission as it transforms, and in particular talk about some of the issues leading to a substantial increase in complaints in 27-18. And at the end of Ray's presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to type questions, and we'll pick up on those questions and get through as many as we can. By way of housekeeping, Ray's presentation will probably go for about 35 minutes, and then we'll cross to questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes. So, laser members and affiliates, you're very welcome. Just to let you all know that this will be an audio and slide presentation only, so there's no video signal. And with that, I'll hand over to Ray. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Gerard, and welcome to everybody out there. It's really wonderful to have this opportunity to be with you this morning, albeit in a virtual way, and I hope that you're going to find what I have to say of use and that we have some time for at least some discussion or questions at the end. Sean asked me to come along and talk to you about our 2017-2018 annual report, which has just recently been tabled in Parliament, and specifically the key highlights and trends of the report. If you haven't seen it, and if after today's presentation you're interested in seeing it, at the end I'll let you know our website details, because it's certainly available through our website, and I'm very proud of it, so I hope that you'll go and have a look for some more detail afterwards. This is actually a particularly special annual report for me. I've been in the role, by the end of this year it'll be 3 years as Aged Care Complaints Commissioner, and as you'll probably be aware, in April this year, the Minister Ken Wyatt, announced the establishment of a new Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, which is bringing together me and my team, or my team, in fact, the Aged Care Complaints Commissioner entity, the Department of Health, or parts of it, and the Australian Aged Care Quality Agency, and to form a new independent aged care regulatory body known as the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, which will be responsible by the end of next year in total for the approval, accreditation, assessment, monitoring, compliance and complaints management, it's a bit of a mouthful, for all Commonwealth subsidised aged care providers. So the new Commission commences operations from the 1st of January 2019, which means that depending on the passage of the legislation going through on time, that the Aged Care Complaints Commissioner, as it is now, and I will cease to exist on that date, and so will the Quality Agency. These two agencies will be the initial part of the new Commission, and the Department's aged care regulatory and compliance functions will join that Commission from the 1st of January 2020. So it's a kind of 18-month, 2-year process. So as I said, this is my last annual report as the Independent Aged Care Complaints Commissioner, and it's been a really big and busy year for us, as I'm sure it has been for all of you, even not taking into account some of the recent events. So let's take a look at some of the work that we've done at the Complaints Commissioner's Office and some of the results and some of the things that we're seeing. So as you may have seen in the few sort of media stories that have been about the annual report, this year more people than ever before have actually come to the Complaints Commissioner seeking our help to resolve concerns about aged care. This isn't a surprise. More and more people are receiving care, as I'm sure you know, and particularly in their own homes. And we cover complaints not just about residential aged care, but all the various forms of Commonwealth subsidised care that's available out there in the community in people's own homes. We're now nearly 3 years old, and we've spent a lot of that time working very hard at increasing our visibility, and I believe we have a very clear identity. Of course, there's always more work to do. I'd be the first to say that there are still to admit there are still people out there who either don't know about us or who do know about us but perhaps feel a little reluctant or a little too vulnerable to seek our help. But nonetheless, we've seen a big jump in our recorded complaints, which I'll show you soon, and it's probably one of the biggest highlights from my perspective of what's in our report. Complaints are resolved in a number of ways. So where possible, we support people to resolve their concerns quickly and as directly as possible with the service provider. We work, between the two parties, and you'll also see in the annual report that this is reflected in a very high number of cases that we're able to resolve early and relatively quickly with the cooperation of both parties. And by that, obviously, I include providers who are very willing to step up and help us to get the concerns sorted out. In certain circumstances, we release information to other organisations, most notably, of course, the Quality Agency, the Department of Health, but also state and territory governments, public health units, the police, coroners, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency and healthcare complaints bodies. We do this when the other agencies are better placed to assist or to act on information. That might be one reason we make a referral, but we also do it in terms of some of the shared relationships and responsibilities we have with the department and the agency, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. This year, you'll see in the report we have had a significant increase, I will say more than 100% increase in the number of referrals we've made to external organisations, in particular the Aged Care Quality Agency. The other trend that I will touch on is that although most complaints continue to be about residential care in terms of actual numbers, we've seen over the 3 years a sustained and very noticeable increase in the number of people who come to us to complain about care delivered in the home. And those complaints are growing at a faster rate than residential care complaints. We're also seeing, when I talk about the trends and the issues we're seeing in complaints, we've seen an increase in complaints about staffing in residential care. That may not surprise you, and I will talk about that a little bit later, about staff numbers, as well as concerns have come up about additional fees charged in residential care, so I'll touch on that too. As I said earlier, I think the marked increase in complaints numbers is actually a good thing. It does mean that more people know about us and are willing to come to us, and I believe it's in part due to our education function and the work that we've been doing to increase our visibility, and working with providers to help encourage people to complain and to know that it's okay to do so. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've done this year to raise our profile, to let providers and consumers know about us, and to support the complaints processes that go on out there. So hopefully we can get all that done in half an hour. Jared's sitting here beside me nodding. Oh. So let's talk about, if I can find the right slide, let's talk about complaint numbers. So this year we had more than 12,000 contacts. So that's we had 12,398 contacts. That's mostly people ringing us up, but also coming through our online complaint and inquiries forms and through correspondence such as letters and emails. Occasionally people do drop into our offices. We're in 7 cities around the country, but it's pretty rare for people to walk in to see us. Now, as you can see from the slide, of those more than 12,000 contacts, 5,779 were translated into complaints. So if you're wondering about what happened to all those other contacts, most of those were inquiries. Now, inquiries can be a whole range of things. They might be out of scope. There might be someone ringing up thinking I can help them with their problems they're having with their telecommunications provider. And in those sorts of cases, we try to make sure that there's no wrong door and we support people and help them to get to the right place. But they can also be quite often inquiries from people who do have concerns, but they want to know what their rights are or how to raise it with the provider, or they just need some information. And in those cases, we will usually give them the information, but also let them know that if they can't resolve it themselves, then they can certainly come back to us. And we often also put them in touch with the aged care advocacy services, who are a very good resource for people around the country. Complaints to us overall in the 3 years, if you look at that slide, you'll see we've had a significant increase each year. We've done some sums, and we've worked out that since 2015-2016, which is when the old department scheme was transferred over to me, complaints have increased by 47%. So we think that's a pretty significant number. And as I said earlier, we're actually not surprised that they're increasing. I mean, there is the fact that we've been working hard to increase our visibility, but also, as you all know, more and more people are receiving care, particularly in their own homes. I guess you'd be interested to know that most of the complaints that we get, particularly about residential care, tend to come from family members or representatives of the person receiving care, although sometimes it comes from consumers, care recipients. Whereas, interestingly, the increasing numbers of complaints that we're seeing about care in the home quite often come from consumers themselves. And again, I think that's a good thing, because if you think about it, someone sitting at home receiving a service that they may have waited a long time for and may have had some trouble getting, vulnerable, perhaps more vulnerable than someone sitting in an aged care facility in terms of raising a complaint about that person or that service that they're dependent on. The other point I'd make is that although the complaint numbers are going up, it's really worth remembering, and I say this often, particularly in response to media requests, that more than 1.3 million older Australians are receiving some form of Australian government-funded aged care service. So even 5,779 complaints nationally is still a relatively small figure when you put it into that context. So I'll touch on some of the trends. So I mentioned home care complaints and what we're seeing there, and the fact that over the 3 years, every year we've seen some growth in the proportion of complaints that come to us about services that are delivered to people in their own homes. So while residential care complaints continue to account for the majority of our complaints, we're now seeing about 25% of all complaints. It's about 1 in 4 are about care given to people at home. And when I talk about care at home, I'm including complaints about both the Commonwealth Home Support Program and home care packages. In terms of the issues that people raise about those services, the 5 top issues are, in this order, from 1 to 5, fees and charges in home care, lack of consultation and communication, communication about fees and charges, client assessment and service implementation, and social and domestic assistance. Now, some of those are self-explanatory. Some of them are actually really around the quality. A lot of them have a sort of theme around the quality of information given and about failures to communicate appropriately or adequately. Things like changes to the service or, why certain services are being delivered or not being delivered, why someone didn't turn up or isn't going to turn up, why there's been a change in carer. Those sorts of issues are not uncommon in terms of these top 5 things that we see. I think Gerard's nodding his head here with agreement. I can't see the rest of you, but I'm sure that these issues are familiar to some of you anyway. The other thing I wanted to highlight from the report, as I mentioned earlier, we're still finalising, despite the big increase in numbers, an enormous number of complaints relatively quickly and relatively informally and directly, with, I will add, huge cooperation from many providers around the country. So in 2017-2018, of those complaints that we had open, we finalised 5,738. Now, 93% of these, that's 5,317 complaints, were finalised in what we call early resolution. And that's where we're doing the informal working with the parties to try and just simply fix or address whatever it is that is of concern. And if you look at the annual report, ultimately we close quite a lot of those cases, about 60% of the issues that we deal with in those cases, to the satisfaction of the complainant, which is something I'm pretty proud of, and I think that shows a lot of good work by everyone involved. We also close the vast majority of those cases very quickly, in 30 to 60 days. So, those are things that I think I can be very proud of my team and what they achieved, but I also think, again, they point to a good level of cooperation and people being prepared to work with us out there to address the concerns that people have about aged care. And of course, I'd also be the first to admit that we only see the complaints that come to us. So, there are many other things, no doubt, that don't even get to us, that are being resolved at the front door when people raise issues with aged care staff, either in their homes or in facilities. One thing I will say about that, and I will touch on it a bit later, is that we do see a lot of missed opportunities by service providers to respond to complaints in a manner that means they don't come to us. So everyone who comes to us, we do ask them whether they've tried to resolve it with a service provider first, and the vast majority say that they have. And then when we tease it out and ask them, why they've still come to us, it's generally because they're unhappy with the outcome. Now, it may or may not have been a realistic outcome that they expected, but I think it certainly speaks to me about there being some opportunities there that perhaps if things are handled slightly differently to resolve matters, more of these matters without them needing to come to us. We also hear from people who say, no, they haven't approached the service provider because they haven't thought it would be worthwhile or they're too scared to. And again, I think those are missed opportunities to ensure that people know it's okay to come and raise concerns, and more importantly, they know that it will be worthwhile doing so because it will be responded to properly and they will be assisted with whatever it is that's bothering them. So I think one of the things that I've been very strongly trying to advocate this year and previously is greater transparency and proactiveness by service providers around complaints, because I think the more that they're out in the open, the more people can see it's okay to come and raise concerns and that things do get done as a result of the concerns that are raised. I've been meeting this year as part of our sort of education function, I've been meeting with some of the governing boards for some of the big providers and talking to them about this and sort of challenging them to put out into the public domain more information, not just about complaint numbers, but about what you do about them. And I've yet to see, I've seen a few who are sort of starting in that direction, and I think that's a really good trend, and I would encourage others to continue to work towards doing that. So I mentioned before the top issues that we see in complaints about care delivered in people's home. I thought I'd touch also on residential care issues. So as I mentioned earlier, the lion's share of complaints, although they're not growing by as much as home care complaints, but the biggest number of complaints we get are about residential care. And there are three top issues, and there's been one change this year which I will highlight. So medication administration and management is still probably the most common issue or common complaint that we receive for residential care, and that can cover a whole range of things relating to concerns about people not getting their medication or not getting it on time, being over-medicated, not being reviewed regularly by a medical practitioner, or whether or not there's been appropriate reviews to see if the medication is still effective or still necessary. We often find in looking at these cases that the records relating to medication administration can be inadequate, and one of the things that concerns me is that for the 3 years in this role, this has been a constant. Has been in the top 5 or top 3 residential care complaint issues almost every year, and yet it's an area that's highly preventable. And I think if you look at the quality agency statistics in terms of what gets homes in particular into trouble in terms of the quality agency and accreditation, medication issues are up there as well. So it seems to me that certainly thinking about the new commission and what can be done better with the data and so forth, that this is an area that's really ripe for looking at, what are the lessons here that could actually be extracted to sort of see where are the things that maybe could lower the chances of services, running into difficulty in this area, having complaints, ending up with the agency, and being able to, most importantly, improve the care and avoid the problems that arise. The second most common issue in residential care complaints is personal and oral hygiene, and that's another issue that regularly pops up with family members telling us things like, their loved one hasn't been showered or bathed regularly enough, or there hasn't been assistance given with brushing teeth. It's quite common for us to find with the showering ones that the care recipient or their responsible person hasn't actually been asked about preferences for things like showering. And so, that's also been an issue that has been quite commonly in the top residential care complaint issues for a couple of years now. And then the third one, and I will talk a little bit about it later, is a new issue. It's crept into the top 5, in fact the top 3, for the first time this year in relation to residential care complaints, and that's concerns about staff numbers. And some of the concerns that people raise with us are, yes, about the controversial issue that's running publicly about ratios, nurse to resident ratios, but more commonly it's just overall about there not being enough staff, and this translating into examples of poor care. So it's not uncommon for us to hear from people who will say, well, the staff are lovely, but there aren't enough of them, and therefore mum didn't get showered when she should have, or the call bells never answered, or those sorts of things. So that's become a very common issue, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, about what we're doing to try and find out a bit more about what we're seeing through those complaints so that we can inform some of the debate and conversation about that that's going on. In fact, I think that's my next slide. So this year, within the residential care complaints, with every complaint there can be multiple issues. So we don't just count complaints, we count issues. So within those 5,779 total complaints we got this year, there were tens of thousands of issues probably. I'm sorry, I don't have the figure in front of me, but it is in our annual report. But some complaints might be one issue, but more commonly there might be 5, 6, 7, could even be 15 issues in one complaint. So this year, within the complaints we saw about residential aged care, 452 issues were raised with us about staff numbers and ratios. That's how they were sort of put into our database by my staff. Whether it's simply a reflection of the media coverage and the public discussion and level of concern that's been going on is at this stage for me a bit unclear. But I think the fact that it's now crept into our top 3 issues is significant, and the fact that we're hearing from people that this is something they think is going on and they think it's the cause of some of the problems that they're having in terms of their care or their parents' care means that we need to look at it in a bit more detail. So we're having a look at what we can extract from that sort of limited window that we get through complaints, and I'm planning, once we see what we've got, and it may well be qualitative rather than quantitative, I'm planning to I'll write to Laser and to the other peaks and to the Minister and the Department and just share it, because I think, you know, these are the opportunities for us to use complaints to provide information that can help to ultimately identify issues that need addressing and help to improve care. In dealing with these complaints, of course, the test for us is the one around whether the service in question has adequate numbers of sufficiently trained staff to meet the needs of the particular person involved or the resident. If we are concerned about, more generally, this is a systemic thing, or about staffing, and in looking at those cases, we generally make referrals to the Quality Agency. While we go on and we'll look at the individual instance of what happened. So, for instance, mum not getting her showers when she should or as she wants or regularly enough, and working with the provider and the complainant to sort that out for that person. I'm interested actually in your thoughts on this particular issue and trend. So if we have some time at the end, you know, I'd certainly be interested even through the system if there are any comments on those matters that I've just raised, because I think it's certainly a topical one.
Yeah, just a reminder to people that you can type your questions or comments in the bottom left of your screen.
Now, earlier I also mentioned that one of the other issues that we see through residential care complaints is about additional fees, and I thought I'd touch on this because, again, it's topical, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. One of the first things I noticed when I came in as Aged Care Complaints Commissioner 3 years ago, and I travelled around and I spent time in each of our offices and I listened to the complaints coming in and I talked to the staff, was that my staff were reporting that they were just at that time starting to get a number of calls from people raising questions about additional fees and charges in residential care. Now, at that time and up to more recent times, a number of those complaints were about things like capital refurbishment or asset replacement charges. But we were also getting questions and complaints from people about the sort of bundling of fees into packages and what that meant for them and whether it was allowed and those sorts of things. In recent years, so this issue isn't one that's in our sort of top 5, but it is an issue that has been quite consistent and it stands out because it sort of suddenly appeared a couple of years ago and it's kept going. And the other thing that makes it stand out for me is that it's one area where I guess we've come to it's been a bit tenser in terms of our relationship with providers, if I can put it in that way. Some of the providers that we've engaged with about this have actually been quite aggressive in their response. And you'll actually see in our latest annual report, and certainly last year's, that when we've had to go to the sharp end, which happens rarely, where I will direct the provider to take action, or we'll give notice first that we're going to and then go to directions, that the fees and charges in Resi-Care is probably the most common issue that causes that. We're less likely to need to do that with clinical care issues, but when we get to the financial issues, that's what's been happening. As some of you or many of you might know, in March this year there was a federal court case about the asset replacement capital refurbishment charges, and it was made clear through the judge and the judgment there that those charges are prohibited under the Aged Care Act. And at that stage, providers wrote to us and said they were going to cease charging these fees. And we've seen since that time a significant reduction in complaints about additional fees and charges in residential care. So I think that's a good thing, and the court case has been quite helpful from our perspective. But we are still seeing complaints about additional fees in residential care, and they are around the bundling and the other fees that are being charged. And it tends to be people who are concerned that they shouldn't be asked to pay for things that they can't use or don't want, that they haven't had sufficient choice, that they're being told that to take it or leave it, you know, you either pay for this bundle or you don't come here, go somewhere else, and about issues such as whether the fees can be renegotiated when someone's needs change or ability to use them. So we're watching very closely the work that the department's doing with the sector and with groups like yours to see. I know there are a lot of things there that are still to be resolved, but in the meantime I thought it was worth just touching on the fact that it is still very much an issue that's live for us and coming through as Complaints Commissioner. And as I mentioned, fees and charges, which are, you know, in home care, a somewhat different beast, but still there, certainly continue to top the list of issues in relation to complaints about care at home. And continuing with the trends and themes, so the other key thing that stands out in our latest annual report, as I touched on earlier, is that we have made a significantly more referrals to other agencies, most notably the Quality Agency. And the referrals we make to the Quality Agency have most commonly related to issues around behaviour management, conduct of personnel, falls, so both prevention and post-fall management, and issues around medication administration and management. We made more than double the referrals. This year we made more than double the referrals than we did the previous year. And I think what it shows is a couple of things. One is a much stronger, clearer relationship between the two organisations, who, as I mentioned earlier, will be one come the end of the year. But the other thing is I think we've become very clear that with complaints resolution as our focus, that where there are issues that are either potentially systemic or whether there is a concern or a need to make sure that, we think there's a high risk of health or welfare or safety of care recipients or residents being compromised, then the organisation that can step in and act more quickly than we can and has greater powers than we can in that respect is the agency and or in conjunction with the department. So if we, for instance, get a complaint and we think we risk assess every complaint, we think on seeing it, wow, on the information in front of us, we're really concerned about the safety of a resident or residents, or we think there's some major systemic thing happening, we'll make an early and quick referral to the agency while we get on and focus on resolving the complaint. Because for us to, rush in and do a site visit and things like that, if we found something, we would then have to get the agency to make a visit as well. So it's just, I think, a lot more clarity around our role and the agency's role. And it'll be interesting and important to see how that translates going into the new commission. You'll see, as part of that, in fact, from our annual report, that we now do very few site visits, and I know it's something we've been criticised for publicly. But again, the old scheme, when it was based in the department for a long time, was an investigation-based scheme, so it had to do site visits. And then it had compliance and mandatory reporting as part of its function. So again, site visits were part of its role. We don't have those things as part of our functions as Complaints Commissioner. We are resolution focused, and so while site visits can be useful as part of an investigation if we need to make sure that we've got the right information or we understand something correctly, and are also useful if we want to go and meet and talk to people, including care recipients, we don't use them in a kind of audit or inspectory sort of way, which is really much more the role of the agency than us, and that's reflected in the referrals. So moving through, I'm not sure how we're going for time. I'm just about at the end, so we can have some time for discussion. I mentioned that another very important part of my functions, as well as the sort of reactive complaints work, is the proactive education work. And I think that's really important because ultimately, we don't want to be continuing to receive more and more and more complaints when many of them could be dealt with much more satisfactorily and much more quickly and directly early on if people are able to raise their concerns with the services involved and get them addressed appropriately. And also if some of the things that lead to complaints, that if lessons are learned and things have changed, they don't get the same complaints about the same thing over and over again. So that's why we think the education focus is really important, and I'm pleased to see that it will continue into the new commission. It's one of the things in the draft legislation that the new commission will continue to have an education function, both the one that I have and also the one that the Quality Agency has at the moment. So some of the things we've been doing, there's a lot set out in the annual report, but we've delivered a number of education sessions around the country, 92, including visiting regional areas across the states and territories and running information booths at various events. We participated in Aged Care Roadshow in rural and regional Queensland with the Department of Health, and we've presented a number of major conferences, including the Laser National Conference, and I'm going to be attending another one in a couple of weeks in Adelaide, for those of you who are there. So if you are on this call and you're at that conference, come and say hello, because it'd be nice to put some faces to some of the people I'm talking to. So in our presentation work, we've focused on a number of themes, including very much the one that I've touched on today, or two that I've touched on today. One is the promotion of my challenge to providers to be more open about complaints and the need to make it easy to complain. And the other one is around the opportunities that we believe are being missed to resolve complaints early and directly. So we refer to that as the golden moment. Many of you who have had a medical background will know that in health there is this concept of the golden hour, that if the quicker you get emergency treatment if something goes wrong, especially if it's within the first 60 minutes, the greater your chances are of survival. Well, our view is, based on long and hard experience, that the better and earlier you respond to a complaint, the greater the chance of a successful outcome and getting it resolved, and so that people can just move on rather than it escalating and getting harder and harder to resolve. So that's why we've been urging providers to talk more about complaints and to use complaints to improve their services and to make complaints, just kind of a normal part of day-to-day business. We've also been encouraging consumers to be a bit more proactive about asking prospective services, not just about their complaints processes and how they handle them, but how many complaints they get and also, more importantly, what they do about them. I've been doing complaints for 13 years now in the health and disability aged care areas, and certainly the earlier and more directly a matter is addressed, the better the likely outcome. As I said before, it just gets harder and harder otherwise, and certainly by the time people come to us, it's often very hard because relationships are broken down. We've developed some resources. We've built on some of the resources we've developed earlier, and there is, I think some of you might be interested to know, we have got 10 top tips for, I think there's 10 anyway, top tips for service providers in managing complaints, which is a resource that's available to you through our website. There's also some video resources and various other things. I'll give you in a minute the website details, but just know that there's a lot of materials there and booklets and so forth. The top tips for service providers for managing complaints is a new resource we did this year, and it builds on a similar one that we did for consumers the previous year. And as I said, both of them are available through our website, along with a comprehensive collection of other resources, which we hope will help people both receiving care and those of you delivering it. And very importantly, we have to work closely with other agencies. I've mentioned in brief many of those that we do work with. This year, as a new thing, we've signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the Older Persons Advocacy Network, recognising the importance of the service they provide and the overlap, I guess, between what they do and what we do. And we've updated our memorandums of understanding with other organisations such as the Quality Agency, all of which will soon be a bit academic because we'll be part of the same new commission. So as you can see and hear, it's been a pretty busy year for the Complaints Commissioner, or for me and my team, more importantly my team, and I'm really proud of our organisation and our achievements both this year and in our 3 years to date. We do remain committed to doing whatever we can to ensure the public, and by that I mean both providers and older Australians and their families have confidence in us as a primary mechanism for the individual resolution of concerns that arise. And although we transition to a new commission soon, we're continuing to work hard to raise our profile so that more people know about us and know that how to raise a concern. Moving forward, there are two key focuses for us. One is, as I mentioned, the need to ensure that people do know where to go with complaints and how they can be dealt with. And the second is to ensure that people feel safe to complain and that vulnerable people, including those who lack capacity or family visitors or support, are able to raise any concerns that they have. So that's me. I can see that we've got a few questions and things coming through, Gerard. I'm very happy in the time that's left to engage.
Thanks, Ray. Look, that was extremely informative. A whole lot of rich information there in a short time, and we will have the slides and the recording of the webinar available as well. So, look, we've got some questions coming through, so we'll move to those. And Helena, yes, there are questions, so if you want to type a question. Certainly, we could kick off. You mentioned that the number of complaints you receive about home care are increasing, that they're increasing faster than residential complaints. Why do you think that is? And Alfreda asks, what were the 4 and 5 of the top home care complaints? She just missed those.
Okay, so. Yeah. So the 4 and 5, the 5 issues were for home care complaints. Fees and charges was number 1. Lack of consultation communication, number 2. Communication about fees and charges, number 3. Client assessment and service implementation was number 4. And social and domestic assistance was number 5. I think that the reason they're increasing is a bit to do with, all the other stuff that's been going on in the environment. So, I mean, firstly, you've got more people receiving this type of care. Secondly, I think you've got an environment where, we've moved to consumer-directed care, and also where people are being given a lot more information. People can now see their financial statements. They can be actively involved in the discussions around and have, I guess, a greater sense of ownership around what care they're going to receive and how they're going to receive it. And of course, those things lead to questions and concerns. So again, I think it's not surprising that these complaints are going up. But as I said earlier, I also think that this is a cohort who, while they may have more capacity than people in residential care to raise their own concerns and complaints themselves directly, are also potentially more vulnerable, or may feel more vulnerable in terms of not wanting to lose or jeopardise the service they're receiving.
Thanks, Ray. Michelle asks, what are some of the key issues being raised about home care fees specifically? Is it admin or costs to deliver services?
Both. So it's, I mean, it's pretty wide ranging, but not, again, not rocket science. It's the sort of stuff you would expect. It's things like the proportion of the fees that are going on things like case management and administration. But also value for money comes up quite a bit. I mean, it's really interesting. I think people are very conscious of the fact that they want some bang for their buck, and they want to make sure that the money that's coming through their package is being well spent and they're receiving some value for that. It was interesting. I did meet with a group of consumers at one stage. In fact, it might have been last year. Attended an event, and these were people whose parents had now passed on and gone to residential care. And one of the things that struck me was how many of them had unspent funds in their packages. And a lot of that was because they've been so frugal, and their children were now saying, wow, we wish we'd made sure that mum or dad had made the most of that money to get, you know, better quality of life instead of doing without.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Kerry asks, will the Commission or the new agency ever look to receive complaints about non-government funded service providers in quote, unquote, as more cowboys enter the industry?
Well, that's outside. I mean, I don't know. That's a policy decision, but I'm certainly aware that I think it's something that, you know, in terms of risks, it's something that the decision makers are aware of as being something to think about. I mean, the way in which we deal with complaints about, you know, sort of subcontracted or contracted services, some of those things we, you know, obviously have to look at the responsibilities of the government-funded entity that then does the contracting and subcontracting. But I know what you're talking about is something a little bit different, which is people who are directly employed, and that's going to be a whole other conversation and some decisions to be made. But you're right to identify, you know, there are very real risks there.
It's certainly a growth area. And Michelle asks, do you have a feeling, Ray, on case management fees being included in the package, or should there be additional funding or costs excluded and paid by the client according to whether or not they wish to have case management?
Again, getting into the area of opinion, which I have to say as a statutory office holder, I really can't, you know, go down that route. I mean, for me, I guess what I can say is that my sense is that the most important thing is to get the communication and the provision of information right. And when I talk about the provision of information, it's around, you know, people being given good information in a form that they can understand. And really sort of get their heads around. Because, you know, some of what comes to us as complaints about these areas, you know, sometimes it's actually more a matter of people just getting some really good explanation and understanding that they don't quite, that they haven't been able to get from the service or the provider. You know, sometimes we can actually sort of fix it in a way by providing information that they could have been given by the provider.
So regarding the service implementation issue, the issues with that in that cohort of complaints specifically that you're aware of that are rising or more high profile, and also do you have any tips on outstanding provider responses to those top 5 complaints and the way that they handle those, or is that a whole other area of expertise?
Well, not in front of me. You know, I mean, we'd have to do some other analysis of our work. I mean, I would hope that even though those are the top 5 things, and equally the top 3 in residential care, that a large proportion of those complaints have still, well, they must have been able to be resolved relatively quickly by working with the providers through that early resolution. You know, if 93% of all our complaints are being able to be resolved in that way, then that suggests that even if the providers haven't got it right the first time, or there's been an issue that's led to a concern, they've got it right in terms of helping to get it resolved.
It's a pretty strong number, 93%, isn't it?
To be able to do them in that way,
but I guess it's something that as an industry we can always look to improve on and improve those skills at dispute resolution skills at local level.
Particularly when, as I said before, you know, of those 5,779 complaints we got last year, the majority of those people would have tried to resolve their complaints with the provider first. So whether there is ability there to reduce that number coming to the new Commission in future because providers are able to resolve those matters themselves, then I would think that should be what everybody's aiming for, because it's in everyone's interest. It's better for the consumers because, you're much more likely to get they're more likely to get a good outcome they can live with, and you don't get to the point where everyone's getting angry with each other and doesn't trust each other and all that kind of thing that we see.
Norma asks, do you keep data distinguished between the home care package and the CHST?
Yes, you'll see in our report we do break it down. It's just for the ease of presentations. I just put together all. I mean, we do what are the other ones for Indigenous and Flexi and all that kind of stuff. So if you look in the annual report, you'll see a breakdown of the various iterations of care that's funded out in the community. But for presentations, I just put it all together.
Just on that 93%, obviously quick resolution is important. How do you make sure the issues are examined appropriately, and is there a chance that some issues can fall through the gaps?
Every complaint is risk assessed when we receive it, and it continues to be risk assessed as we go along. You know, as we are acutely conscious that as a you know, with that resolution-based approach, that we still have to be very much aware that there are some things that need to be escalated and go through to more formal processes. We have an in-house, we have a clinical framework, so we have registered clinicians who assist at the sort of front end in terms of the assessment and triage and complaint stuff, but we also have an expert clinical advice unit who administer the framework and support the registered clinicians, and that advice unit on the really hard complex cases, or if there's stuff where we think there's a real live high risk matter that needs to be dealt with and maybe dealt with in a more formal way through an investigation or such like and referral, then we involve the clinical advice unit. I mean, it's just one example of how we do it. We do other things as well.
Thanks, Ray. Ray, the staff ratio issue obviously is very high profile, and well, I shouldn't say staff ratio, staffing. What can you do? You mentioned there's been a bit of a trend, and it's also been highlighted in the media. What's your stance on the whole issue of staffing levels?
Well, I don't have a stance. I mean, our position is that in relation to complaints, our stance is that we have to, the test for us is whether or not through that complaint it provides evidence one way or another as to whether or not there were appropriately numbers of, sufficient numbers of appropriately trained staff at the time and in relation to what occurred. That's where it's at for us. And if we think that there is a wider systemic thing, either in relation to what the complaint raises or in relation to information we come across, for instance, we might see that it appears that providers not managing staffing issues well, they're not filling properly when people are on sick, and they're not having got enough people on at certain times or whatever to meet the needs of those residents, or there's a training issue, then we will try and address it through the complaint, but we'll also make referrals to the agent.
Anna asks, how common is it that the complaint is raised by a third party, but the customer does not agree with the issues raised?
Well, as I said, quite a lot of complaints in residential care certainly come from family members, and sometimes, as some of you will know, there can be issues even within families in terms of agreement about the issues that have been raised. We're required, rightly, I think, under the sort of rules we operate under, the legislation, to consider the views of the care recipient, and if they're not able to express a view, then obviously the person who walks in their shoes, their legal representative. And that can be one of the reasons we might decide not to proceed with a complaint. But that said, and I would say to my staff, it is a very serious thing to proceed with it in the face of someone not wanting you to look at something that's about them. But equally, we do have to be cognizant that if the complaint raises a potential issue of wider concern, we may well still need to do it anyway. The other thing I would say is that we do obviously have to very carefully manage privacy concerns. So when a complaint is raised by a third party, whether it's a family member or potentially a staff member or an anonymous complainant or someone from the community, with every complaint we will share the outcome, well, with most actually, depending on what we do with them, but just about all the complaints we do report back to the person who's made a complaint the outcome and give them a lot of information, if they're entitled to it, about what we did and why and what we found. But in cases where it's a third-party complainant, obviously we have to be very cognizant of privacy, and therefore we will limit the amount of information we share. We also will take into account if, for instance, a care recipient is happy for us to do the complaint but doesn't want us to share some of the information with their daughter, family or whatever, then equally we will limit the information that we might share with the family complainant.
Well, look, that brings us to the end of our time. So, Ray, I'd just like to say on behalf of LASER and our members, thank you sincerely. To have the Complaints Commissioner herself come down and speak to the annual report is a great resource for us and for our members. So we really appreciate it. I trust that our audience has found it very informative, some really interesting stuff and some really insightful and thought-provoking trends and data there that I think can inform better practice going forward as well.
Can I say, I hope actually, probably made the annual report sound quite dry, but we focused on outcomes this year. So there are some fantastic case studies and real-life stories of how complaints have made a difference to people. So I would encourage people to go and have a look, have a read. It is a good read, I think.
Thanks once again, Ray. And just to our audience, the recording and the slides and information will also be provided to you in ASAP. So thank you very much and have a good day.